When talking about this Ohio State Buckeye team, it pretty much does come down to your worldview, as Kyle Rowland from the Toledo Blade joins us now. And Kyle, if you're a glass half full guy, you take a look at that first half, say, hey, Buckeyes 35-3, they look great against Rutgers. Or if you're a glass half empty person, you go, wow, they got outscored by 10 points in that second half, and they didn't look so good. And we've seen them be inconsistent in all three games this year. So through three games, what can we make out of this Ohio State team outside of they are the best team in the Big Ten, but that might not be saying much in the Big Ten this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're still clearly in that elite category. I mean, even though Notre Dame beat Clemson, I mean, I really think there's three teams that are capable of winning the national title this year: Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson. I just, from what I've seen, I don't know if any of the others have a real legitimate chance to run through that playoff, because you're going to probably have to beat two of those teams. And I don't know if the other teams can do it, but that Rutgers second half, I mean, I know you're nitpicking when you're talking about the second half of a game. Ohio State was up 35-3 and had 353 yards in the first half. But it just wasn't great. It wasn't crisp. This was the type of game you wanted your backups to have a chance to kind of get some snaps and get some reps. You don't know how many of them might come and play later this year, just with COVID and all this stuff. I mean, there were missed tackles galore on defense, a lot of penalties on offense. I think they had 5 holding penalties, 3 of which happened, were called on Harry Miller. I don't know. I know Ryan Day talked about, they got up early and that could have been part of it. And then it's a night game with no fans, and it's the body clock's getting late at 9-10 o'clock. I think those are all legitimate things, but as a coach, you just want perfection, and they were nowhere near that. And I know a lot of fans would say, well, when they get into a big game, like, they'll be fine. They've got the talent, whatever. That is true. But you can't always just turn it on in sports. You have to kind of work up that progression. You always want to be playing your best. You can't always just rely on flipping the switch. So that's why I think it was a little bit concerning what happened in that second half against Rutgers.
Which makes me be a little concerned that perhaps we're going to see a similar outcome to 2013 and 2015, where Ohio State seemingly, they beat everybody those years except for one game. But we're always waiting for them to flip that switch. And when they had to flip that switch against Michigan State in 13 and against Michigan State in 15, they couldn't quite do it. So we're not expecting them to be challenged that much against Maryland this week. We'll talk about what Maryland's been able to do offensively. But when is this team, they're not firing on all cylinders. And Ryan Day was very clear about that we expect perfection, as you touched on, and we haven't been perfect. So is that going to come back in and bite this Buckeye team?
I mean, I guess we'll find out. I don't really think. I know Indiana has looked solid. I would be stunned if they won. I mean, that would take a drastic turn of events. I mean, there'd have to be major injuries. I don't think Ohio State just playing horrible would make them lose to Indiana, just with the talent disparity and everything involved there. Michigan, I'd be stunned if they lost. I mean, in the Big Ten title game, I guess, perhaps Ohio State could lose that. But I don't really see anything in the regular season. They just want to play well. And last week, you thought was going to be that first game. They had Rutgers, Maryland, Indiana, and then Illinois. It's kind of a stretch where you would hope to get in sync, and they only really did it for one half. I do think there's a little bit of benefit to the coaches having the team's full attention, and certainly this week they're going to, with the way they performed last week. Maryland has played really well since the first week of the season. Tua's brother, Talia, has been a really bright spot after their first game against Northwestern, where he was terrible. I mean, to be quite honest. They were great at Penn State. The coaches are going to drill that into their heads. And then they got Indiana the week after, which they're going to have to be sharp and play well in that game. And I think that'll be a game where they're very motivated. It's a top 10 game in late November. Who would have ever thought that with Ohio State, Indiana? But that's exactly what it's going to be. So, I mean, I still expect Ohio State to get into rhythm. You do got to keep in mind they didn't have spring practice. The summer was weird. I mean, just everything about this year is different. That's not an excuse, and it certainly is not an excuse for teams that haven't lived up to their billing. I mean, Penn State, Michigan come off the top of my head. Like, they should not be able to just say, oh, COVID-19 year, there's an asterisk. I don't believe in that at all. But I think Ohio State does kind of need to kick things into gear here as November goes along.
I think this would be a very frustrating week for Allen Iverson because we are talking about practice and the fact that Ohio State did not practice very well against Rutgers. And I think another disconcerting part about that is when we talked to Jonathan Cooper on Tuesday, he said, we knew Rutgers was going to throw some trick plays at us. We saw that the week before. So they knew these trick plays were coming, and yet they didn't follow their rules. They didn't follow their assignments, and they got burned by a couple of different trick plays. That throwback that we saw both on a kick and a punt, you saw it twice in that game, and they weren't prepared for it on the punt. That is one of those mental lapses that I think is frustrating.
Yeah, totally. And there was a lot of that in the second half. I mean, first of all, it was a kind of a fun second half to watch. I mean, Rutgers just threw everything they could at Ohio State. I don't know why they didn't do some of that stuff in the first half, quite frankly. Maybe it would have been an even more interesting game. But yeah, I mean, there were just missed assignments. I know a lot of people think, oh, it's trick plays. Like, you can kind of excuse that. But that's not totally true. And like you said, Ohio State was expecting some of that stuff, and they still didn't execute up to their ability. There were some over pursuing. There were tons of missed tackles. I mean, this was the worst tackling game I've seen Ohio State have probably since 2018. I think that's a little bit of a red flag. And a lot of stuff in that second half happened against a majority of the starting defense. There really weren't a ton of backups on defense until late in the fourth quarter. So this is maybe the type of game where you want those things to happen, because you still won the game. You still won by 4 touchdowns, and you can use that as a lesson instead of, a loss to Iowa or Purdue or whoever in recent years. So that's one way of looking at it.
You mentioned 2018. Last time Ohio State went to Maryland was 2018, that game in which Maryland, if they could convert a 2-point conversion, they would have won that game. That was a game that is very fresh in the mind of many of Ohio State's defensive players. And we're looking at a Maryland offense that is better than it was 2 years ago. We know Mike Locksley is a great recruiter. He's familiar with Tagovailoa because he had him down in Alabama when he was behind his older brother Tua. Now he followed him to Maryland. And Talia's been a bit of an eye-opener through the first couple of weeks. And this is a very high, potent Maryland offense that is going to test an Ohio State defense that, as we've talked about, has not been consistent quarter to quarter this year.
Yeah, and the secondary's been a little iffy, especially a guy, Sean Wade, who is really, really good. He's had some not great moments this year. I mean, if I'm Maryland and Mike Locksley, they need to be aggressive from the get-go. I don't think you can just expect to – play conservative and get a few field goals here and a touchdown there and beat Ohio State. I think they need to just go right at them and try to score early. So I'm really interested to see what their game plan is going to be. And I would assume they will be aggressive. But yeah, I mean, it's been boom or bust, I guess you could say, for Talia Tagovailoa. I think he had 3 interceptions against Northwestern the first week. Less than 100 yards passing. They got just the doors blown off of them. I think it was 44-3, something like that. And then they come back. They beat Minnesota in a thriller, one of the more enjoyable games to watch this season. And then Penn State just utterly just blow them out. I think that was just a stunning result. I know Penn State's missing a lot of players, and effort is a question, I think, at this point for Penn State. But still, they went in. They were up 35-7. They controlled the whole game. So defensively, I think this is kind of a statement game for Ohio State. Just go in there, dominate from the outside of the game, and you'll make your coaches happy. You'll make the fan base happy. I think the players themselves will be happy. And I kind of expect that to happen. I think I wouldn't say it's been constant negativity this week, but there's definitely been just a talk of, not a great performance last week. What are you going to do to kind of, prove yourselves? So I think the defense is just going to be raring to go for Ohio State.
perhaps some unwarranted negativity surrounding the Ohio State program, but some very much warranted negativity surrounding the team up north. It's Ohio State, but they're always keeping an eye on what's going on with Michigan. And Jim Harbaugh is finding himself at 1-2 and a lot more louder shouts across the Michigan fandom that it's time to move on from Jim Harbaugh, that even though he is a Michigan man, he might not be the man Michigan needs going forward. And we can get into how that Michigan man quote from Bo Schembechler has been distorted almost as much as Jim Tressel's 310 days quote has been distorted. But right now, let's just talk about Jim Harbaugh and his future with the Michigan Wolverines.
Yeah, well, remember last week how we said it was rock bottom after the Michigan State game? Wow.
They managed later.
Yeah, they managed to go lower. I thought Michigan would beat Indiana. Certainly, I'm not surprised that they lost. But, I mean, that was a dominant performance by Indiana. It's got to be one of their best performances against one of the big-time Big Ten programs in school history, I would say. Michigan's secondary is, oh, my goodness. If that's what they come to Columbus with, it's going to be really, really ugly because Justin Fields is just going to be all day long throwing to Olave and Garrett Wilson and all of his weapons. I mean, defensively, I think Michigan's a disaster. That's pretty much well stated at this point. The thing that surprised me most on Saturday was the inability of Michigan's offensive line. And I know they had some backups in there, but they could not get Indiana's defensive line off the ball at all. I mean, they averaged less than 1 yard a carry, I think, or right around 1 yard a carry. I think it was either 13 or 18 total rushing yards. I mean, that is just a jaw-dropping statistic. I mean, I know Indiana's playing well, and Tom Allen, they're a confident team and all of that stuff. And, you know, there are upsets, and talent doesn't mean everything, but it means a whole lot. And if you look at the recruiting rankings, Michigan's players are just better by a wide margin than Indiana's. But if you watch that game and you didn't know which team was which, I mean, 100% Indiana was the better team, and they were the better team by a lot. And I just think it's a troubling thing for Michigan. This week's game is a pretty interesting, game just because Wisconsin's been off for so long. Who knows how they're going to play? Is motivation going to become a big problem with Michigan? What does that say about Jim Harbaugh if his team kind of quits a little on him?
Yeah, so Michigan's motivation certainly is going to be one of the things we're going to keep an eye on. I want to ask you about this because I talked about this with Anthony Bellino. A couple of years ago, it seems that Don Brown won maybe an internal power struggle on that Michigan defensive staff, and he was given control, and that eventually led Greg Mattison to coming to Columbus. And maybe Don Brown is getting the success of what Greg Mattison built, and we maybe have seen Don Brown be exposed the last couple of years because that defense has not been the same since Greg Mattison left.
Yeah, I mean, it's 100% truth. I mean, the images, the stats, everything, the results, they don't lie. I mean, Don Brown, as much as we talk about Harbaugh and the shine coming off of him, I think it's even more so for Don Brown. And I think he's lucky that he's not the head coach because he's not catching as much heat as Harbaugh is getting. I mean, they're 10-8 in their last 18 games. And the points and yards they've given up in those losses is just huge. I mean, Penn State last year is like the only real game I can even think of that was like close in that stretch. I mean, they've been blown out by Ohio State twice. They were blown out in both bowl games. They got blown out by Wisconsin last year. The Indiana game last week was not pretty. The Michigan State game, I guess, in score was close, but it wasn't – they never even were leading the game. I mean, it's just been ugly for Michigan's defense. I mean, Don Brown, I don't think he's a bad coach, but certainly he's not what we thought he was in 2018. Too stubborn. He doesn't – these coverages, he's putting these corners on an island, and he just refuses to adjust and change. And it's caught up with Michigan, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to change because that's just his philosophy, and he's been a coach forever. So I just think that's going to continue to be a problem with Michigan. I don't think Harbaugh will be back next year, but if he is, I don't see any way how Don Brown is the defensive coordinator.
It's funny that if we look at this a little bit objectively, outside of not being able to run the ball, offensively, Michigan is in a much better place than they've been the last couple of years. Josh Gaddis, he has done what he was brought in to do. He's opened up that offense. Joe Milton, back-to-back 300-yard passing games. They are scoring enough points. It's the defense that has not been getting the job done almost week in and week out now.
Yeah, I mean, you never would have dreamed that a couple of years ago. I mean, I know that Michigan's problem is not the Ohio State game from 2018, but in a sense, that's still kind of the core of the issue. Like they've never got over that. It just stunned them. I don't know if they've adjusted from that loss. It was just so shocking in the fashion that it happened. And there are major recruiting things too. I mean, they haven't addressed certain things on the defense. You're seeing a lot of those holes on that side of the ball and on offense as well at times. And I just don't know. I mean, it feels like they're just kind of in decline right now. And at the same time, Ohio State is just sprinting the other direction. So who knows how big the gap between these two programs is going to be.
Yeah, I know a lot of people point to the 2016 game as the game that broke Michigan, but I agree with you. I think it was the 18 game was the one that really was the defining moment, the beginning of the end, if you will, of the Jim Harbaugh era in Ann Arbor. But, there's still a couple more weeks to go. Funnier things have happened. Back to the Buckeyes. Ohio State at Maryland. You're confident that Ohio State will not pull another Purdue, not pull another Iowa. They're going to go on the road and come back with a victory on Saturday?
Yeah, I do. And I don't think that they might lose, had they blown Rutgers out last week. But I think that performance and the message and practice and Ryan Day, he definitely has used the media this week to kind of directly get the message to the players. I mean, it almost sounded on Saturday night like he was talking, to the team in the locker room in his post-game press conference. I think that will be heard loud and clear, and I expect Ohio State to, have its most complete defensive performance of the season. Offensively, I see no reason why Maryland would slow Ohio State down. Justin Fields just seems to be on a mission that's going to end with the Heisman Trophy.
All right, thank you very much, Kyle Rowland from the Toledo Blade, for finishing your mission with us tonight here on College Football Weekly.